What's up, Coordination? How you doing? This episode of the GreenPilled podcast is number 2 with Daniel Schmachtenberger. We are talking about the Metacrisis. You should check out episode 1 of the series that we've done together, which was all about what is the Metacrisis. We're doing a 4-part series together. First one was what is the Metacrisis? This one is what are the considerations for governance that can solve the Metacrisis? And then we're going to go into specific Web3 projects and take a look at how they're doing for addressing the Metacrisis. Address the Metacrisis, not solve the Metacrisis. So very brief recap. The Metacrisis is being stuck between catastrophes and dystopias. So basically, catastrophes are coordination failures, our inability to stop climate change, existential risks like biodiversity loss and CRISPR and nuclear war and runaway AGI risk are catastrophes. And they've traditionally been solved by creating dystopias, governments that are authoritarian and can regulate the human activity are usually meant to prevent coordination failures. And with Daniel in our first episode, we talked about how do we build a third attractor? So basically something that can solve for catastrophes and coordination failures, but without centralized and corrupt systems of governance and surveillance on top of them. So looking for a third attractor, a governance system that is decentralized but can solve coordination failures. You can maybe see where this is going if you've been listening to the podcast for a little while, Coordination. So again, 4-part series. What is the Metacrisis was the first episode. You should listen to that episode, but if you didn't, I've just given you a recap of what it was about. And then we're going to talk about considerations for addressing the Metacrisis. That's this episode number 2 of our series with Daniel. And then we're going to talk about Web3 projects and how they are solving for the Metacrisis, addressing the Metacrisis, excuse me. So in this episode, we talk about, is tech values neutral? What are the values that technology imbues in the systems that it is within? We talk about infrastructures, social structures, and superstructures. And we also talk about conflict theory and mistake theory. One of my favorite episodes that we've done so far, Daniel is just so lucid, so articulate. He's thought so much about these things, and I really enjoyed this episode with Daniel Schmachtenberger. The first episode that we did with him was one of the ones that I've gotten the most positive feedback on so far, and so I think that you're really going to enjoy this second episode. So without further ado, Coordination, I give you Daniel Schmachtenberger. Enjoy.
The Opera crypto browser is the world's first web browser built for the crypto community. With Web3 support and a non-custodial wallet, Opera lets you access DeFi apps quickly and easily. The Opera wallet has buy, sell, and swap features, and of course lets you view your beautiful NFTs, but the browser still lets you use any crypto wallet extension you prefer, giving you the choice and flexibility for the Web3 world. Opera lets you view and manage all of your assets across all the blockchains all at once, and offers seamless multi-chain support between Ethereum, Bitcoin, Polygon, Binance Chain, and other EVMs and Layer 2s. But Opera goes even deeper than that. Opera has a built-in homepage for crypto natives with the Opera Crypto Corner, with price charts, news feeds, NFT updates to make sure you are always on top of your game. And it even has Discord and Telegram integrated natively into the browser. That's crazy. Opera is truly building the battle station for the crypto world. Check out Opera both on mobile with Android and iOS apps, and on desktop too. ReFi summer has arrived, and Celo is here for it. Celo is the layer 1 blockchain for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. Celo has committed towards producing a sustainable future from the very beginning, and is the world's first carbon negative, EVM compatible layer 1 blockchain. Celo has become much more than a technology, a currency, a community, or even just a layer 1. Celo is a movement to create conditions of prosperity for everyone. You can soon engage with all of this via green asset Uniswap pools on Celo, benefiting reforestation and other regenerative products through the Toucan protocol, Moss, and more. ReFi is also about the health of communities, and Resource Network is creating Bankless infrastructure for circular trade and mutual credit networks to benefit small businesses and local economies, all on Celo. Follow along on Twitter to learn more about how Celo is accelerating ReFi summer for a positive impact on people, communities, and the planet. If you're attending ECC, visit the Celo Saloon to learn about what's happening on the front lines of ReFi from industry experts.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for coming back.
Excited to be back.
Yeah, likewise. So we're doing a 3 or 4-part series together. The first is what is the Metacrisis? This episode is going to be about the considerations for governance that can address the Metacrisis. And then we're going to, in the next episodes, get into addressing the Metacrisis, possibly with Web3 and Web3 based systems. So let's maybe dive in on considerations for governance that can solve the meta crisis. How do you think about that design space?
Yeah, and I think most people who are listening to this and working in Web3 are probably not thinking, how do we solve the meta crisis, meaning like how do we solve civilization writ large? But
Mm.
it is important in whatever area you're working on to understand how that relates to the other areas you aren't working on in the context of the world. And if we if you're working on some other area and nuclear war starts looking more imminent, you might be like, oh, that is relevant to the topic that I'm addressing. And so obviously we happen to live in a moment right now where nuclear equipped superpowers are in actual armed conflict for the first time in a long time. And climate change and AI and biotech and all the other things, planetary boundaries and stuff we talked about. So that can't not be part of the context if you're thinking forward kind of at all. And I know that here, the reason people are with you at Gitcoin as opposed to other places in the crypto world is the topic of public goods, which is where does the economy, where do the incentive systems of the economy not rightly orient us based on both the ownership and the kind of incentive for extraction and externalization built into currency not rightly orient us to solve certain problems? And where do the structures of governance not rightly orient us? And can we build a political economy? Meaning, can we build an economic system whose incentives are more aligned with the actual world we want to bring about, and where the governance and the coordination are more aligned? And um, so that's why we started with the big picture we did last time. And
Mhm.
then this time, it's definitely not like, here, we're going to give all of the necessary and sufficient criteria for how to design a political economy and solve civilization. Like, we're not, that's more ambitious than what we're going to do. But there are a few high level frameworks that are really important, particularly for technologists who are thinking about building coordination technology, right? Like, how do you actually design technology that can mediate economics and mediate governance? So we're going to talk today about things like the intersection of technology and basically our kind of tech stack writ large, and our social systems and our value systems and the world we're embedded in, and what are some of the ways that those connect that need to be factored into the design of the tech to have it facilitate the right kinds of things. So yeah, just kind of calibrating. I know there's a bunch of interesting projects happening, and can we do a better job with governance if we apply quadratic voting or this type of DAO structure or whatever? And in the next talks, we'll get into specific things there. Um, and so here, I just wanted to share uh, a few more kind of structures of thought that are important to think about at the intersection of the tech that mediates social systems. That's one of the areas that's so interesting. Is for the most part, what a social system is trying to do is to uh, actually help the coordination and regulation of tech, right? And yet the tech that is mediating the social system itself is a unique class of tech. It's not um, mining, even though that term gets used. I mean, it's not mining of the physical substrate of the earth. It's not waste management. It's not transportation. It's not the other things where you need to be like, oh, maybe we need to regulate that to not have certain destructive purposes. It's what is the tech that would facilitate a social system that would in turn regulate the rest of the tech. So it's a very interesting class of things. So uh, yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to getting into today.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think that I got a lot of positive feedback about the first episode. Just people really enjoying the framing of the metacrisis as catastrophes and dystopias, and how do we find this third attractor towards something that can solve coordination failure, but doesn't have the centralization and maybe the the corruptness of a centralized government. And I really I'm just so happy that we're kind of starting to drill down for considerations that can address the meta crisis, and appreciate you saying that we're not going to solve civilization, we're not going to address the meta crisis here, but it's a useful thing for builders to have in their back pocket as they're moving forward in building this technology. So it feels like a great place to start might be is the technology that we're building, does it have values embedded in it? Is the tech values neutral in any way, or does it create a slant in the social systems that we're creating in this space in some fundamental way?
Yeah, obviously, partly this question arises because we just published a paper on this with Consilience Project, and I sent it to you, and I think it'll get linked in the show notes here. And
Yep.
the title kind of gives it away. Technology is not values neutral. Um, but here, what we're looking at is the way that technology affects psychologies and then affects cultures. We could also look at how it affects social systems. But just to kind of let's just zoom in on this part about does tech embed values and does it affect values directly? So think about this. You put a camera around your neck. It's a technology, right? It allows you to take things in your visual field and capture them as pictures. When you have a camera around your neck or in your hand, it affects the way you perceive the world, and it affects your intention because it extends your actuation capacity in a certain way. You can now make photographs. So all of a sudden, the little piece of grass growing through a crack in the sidewalk that you'd have never noticed or thought of, maybe that's a weed I got to get rid of. Now you might think of zooming in and seeing this beautiful picture of the tenacity of life growing through, the Anthropocene
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it is. And so, and the birds all of a sudden get more interesting. And so you can see how literally just holding a piece of tech changes what your attention is drawn to and kind of the meaning that is made on it, and then what you do. Similarly, if you're walking through a forest and you have a spear, you have a whole different set of attunements than if you don't have a spear, right? If you have a chainsaw, trees mean something different, right? The moment you're walking around a forest with a chainsaw versus you're walking around with tree climbing shoes, trees mean something different. And so it's important to get that you could say, oh, tech is values neutral. Chainsaws can be used to cut dead timber and support the forest or to cut live trees. It's the values we bring to it. Kinda. But that's also really just profoundly naive, simplistic thinking. Tech increases our capacity to actuate. That's right. It's an extension of our actuation capacities. It might be an extension of our sensory capacities, like a telescope or a whatever. But and we can connect that all. But I'll start with the actuation side. There's a way that evolution selects for our sensory processes, what we take in about the world, our sense making, how we make sense of that to inform choice, and then our actuation process being in a closed loop, right? Evolution only selects for the closed loop between the information input, information processing, and actuator output. Because if I evolved some capacity to act, but I had no ability to have sensory process informing it, like it doesn't matter how high I can jump if I don't know when I should jump or towards or away from what.
Right.
And so evolution would never select for that. Evolution would also never select for a sense that I couldn't actuate. Like, oh, I can see something that's going to harm me, but I can't do shit about it. Like, so evolution is only selecting between the relationship between those. So of course, if you have some new actuation capacity, it's going to direct your existing sensing capacity to pay attention to the things that can be actuated, right? And so obviously the chainsaw and the tree climbing shoes are going to give you a very different sense of trees. And just to give one good example, and the reason that I'm going into this in a bit of depth and why we actually took the time to write a paper on it is there is no metacrisis without tech, right? Like cavemen cannot destroy the world. Chimpanzees, polar bears, orcas, other apex predators can't destroy the environment. And you can't destroy the world even with stone tools and even with Bronze Age tools. You have to get to industrial and then post-industrial, right? And once you get up into nuclear and exponential tech, you kind of can quickly. And you almost kind of can't avoid it if you aren't being very careful, because that much power, especially driven with embedded growth obligations and multipolar traps and stuff, makes it very likely. So ultimately, it's not that the tech itself is the problem. The tech is extending human capacities for choice. We're making choices that are problematic, but it's not just extending our capacity for choice, it's also predisposing it. And so it's important to understand any solution to the metacrisis is going to involve a fundamentally different relationship with tech. And it's not just that we need to bring better values to how we use the tech. We need to recognize that the nature of how the tech is designed affects the values of the people that are involved. So obviously, a news feed that automatically selects for maximum social interaction score and time on site is going to outrage and polarize and appeal to shorter attention spans and do all that shit. It's the way the tech was designed. Now, that doesn't mean the tech called network-based media had to do that. You could design it differently, right? You could design it where it used the same types of tech capacity to see what would have supermajority support and upregulate that in the newsfeed.
Yeah.
It could specifically put in front of you the things that were most likely to connect you to people outside of your existing network clusters and across memetic tribes. But that's the tech design, right? The tech design will predispose patterns of human behavior. So I want to go a little bit deeper in this, because this is a group of tech designers, and the way that tech affects the world and creates kind of these recursion loops is a critical thing to understand. So at first, we design technology for a specific purpose. And it's usually a fairly narrow purpose. If there's one problem we're trying to solve, or maybe a cluster of 2 or 3 problems we're trying to solve. The word externality is a word that is now pretty well known. It was not previously, but it typically means, it started with economics, right? The idea that your value equation had revenue and expenses, and there was profit, but there were some of the expenses, some of the costs that were externalized to the value equation. Meaning, if I treated trees as a natural resource, I didn't have to reproduce the trees. I could just extract them from the balance sheet of the commons, because the commons didn't have a balance sheet, right? And I could turn it into pollution in the balance sheet of the commons. But basically, I was just stealing from nature's balance sheet. It was an externalized cost, where if I actually had to pay for the real cost of that waste and pollution to be processed in the unrenewable resource, the cost of the thing would go way up. And so that's the idea of externality in economics, and it's related to externalities in tech, right? Externality in tech is you're building something for a purpose, but it affects other purposes that you had not planned for, and that's where you get an unintended consequence or side effect. So obviously, when Facebook made that algorithm choice to maximize engagement for advertising revenue, it wasn't trying to polarize the whole population and break democracy and make people believe crazy stuff, but it did. That was an externality of the design of the tech. And so one of the things that I want all technologists in every field to be thinking about, particularly those working on the most fundamental technologies that would support coordination, meaning like the actual choice making of everybody writ large, is to be thinking about the externalities in their design. You're designing it for these purposes. What else will it affect that you didn't think about? How do you think about that better? And then how do you notice it afterwards and internalize that into the process? The first type of externality that people are used to is a physical externality. Physical externality is you make a pesticide that is intended to help crops, and it ends up killing all the pollinators and going into the water and messing up ecosystems and that kind of thing, right? It's mediated via physical causation. You make a laptop that's easier to carry around than a desktop, and the externality is everybody gets bad necks from looking down all the time because of the ergonomics built into the portability, right? And so physical causation creates physical externalities, but there are also psychosocial externalities and psychosocial causation. And that's the topic we kind of introed in this paper that I want to intro here, which is it's not just the physical tech will do a physical thing. It's also that the tech will incentivize humans to behave differently, because using that tech in a particular way confers advantage that not using the tech doesn't confer. So it's actually, tech is a incentive to behave in the way where the use of that tech confers advantage. In changing the pattern of behavior, you end up changing the encoding of human mind. And that's where you have a psychological effect. And if that starts to happen at scale, you have a social effect. And so we can see the most obvious examples of that with, you make a social media thing where the more likes people get, the more it gets upregulated. You start to put Instagram filters on it, and you get the psychosocial effect of an entire culture becoming more body dysmorphic and narcissistic. Well, it's kind of clear that you do actually, like, you can breed narcissism and body dysmorphia in the entire fucking population, literally because of the design of the tech, right? The combination of the incentive and attention capture and the picture emphasis and you're like, that's pretty bad. Like, the amount of effect it had psychosocially that quickly compared to the amount of psychosocial effect that any religion ever had, it just dwarfs it, right? Like, no meme otherwise outside of the tech could have spread that much change to psychologies and cultures that quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there are ones that have done it that deeply because they were very significant. They just, as tech is accelerating, obviously meaning as tech is getting to bigger scale, and you can create things like Facebook that become dominant in a very short period of time relative to, say, the internal combustion engine or something else. The effects are faster and bigger. But the example I want to give, because it's so illustrative, and the way I'm describing it simplifies a lot, but it's because it gives the gestalt of it,
Mm-hmm.
is the plow. I want people to think through the example of the plow, because we can talk about the printing press. The printing press kind of ended feudalism and ushered in everything from science to modern education to democracy, because now it didn't cost the equivalent of $100,000 to copy a book of someone having to do it by hand who had a very rare skill set. Everybody could have textbooks, everybody could have newspapers, everybody could have their own Bible. So the Lutheran Revolution, we didn't need the priest to interpret the limited Bible for us. So we can see, like, wow, that was a technology that had this radical effect, right? And so the sovereign individual and Balaji and many other people are looking at the way the current infotech will usher in new social changes. The plow is such an interesting example because it wasn't just that it changed our social structures, but our cultural systems in a way that the world is still so fundamentally influenced by. And to just think about it. And before we had the plow, we had other agriculture. We had horticulture and using digging sticks. And the plow was not equal in all environments. Some places that used horses or donkeys that were also used for transportation are different than the places that used buffalo that turn into ox. But let's just simplify it and say the moment you can start to convert an animal's capacity, they can eat food that we can't eat, grazing and whatever, and then they can do all of this tilling and they can convert a whole area to food production. The plow meant that the caloric output that a culture that was using that could do compared to hunting, gathering, or just the human labor digging stick was so much greater that, of course, the moment that technology emerges, it kind of starts to become obligate, because the culture, any civilization that uses it, stops dying in famines, and they grow their population way faster with the caloric surplus, which also means that any other culture that doesn't is a lot more likely to lose in tribal warfare, with a smaller population and things like that. So that's actually one really interesting insight, is if a technology confers a lot of capacity, it also
Mm-hmm.
confers game theoretic advantage in a rivalrous context. So if anyone uses it, everybody has to use it or some comparable thing, or they lose. So there's a way in which tech starts to become obligate. Doesn't necessarily mean that exact tech, but it means the tech stack as a whole has to be competent to be able to deal with the rivalry of other groups. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so some types of changes do become obligate. Obviously, if any group develops a new piece of military tech, it does obligate the other militaries to do something in response. So we see that the plow kind of became obligate because it made so much more food production capacity. But then you also see that, and this is the thing that I think is so interesting about this example. If I have a animal, let's say an ox, that is being used to draw the plow, it doesn't want to do that, right? So we have to yoke it, meaning put the plow around it and then beat it all day long to do that thing. That requires me changing my value systems around animals. So if you look at hunter-gatherer tribes around the world in any continent, they were pretty much all animistic. They talked about the spirit of the whale, the spirit of the buffalo, the spirit of everything. They were cognizant of the great cycle of life, that maybe they kill the buffalo now, but they'll be put into the ground when they die, which will grow grass and their ancestors will eat it, and that whole kind of thing. So they could have a sense of the sacredness of the other life and be part of the cycle of life. But I can't be animistic anymore if I've got to beat the buffalo all day long, right? Beat the
Yeah.
ox all day long. So now it's like, then the memes change from the men are not the web of life, we're merely a strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves in the great circle of life. It changes from that to man's dominion over nature. The animals were put here for our use, that kind of thing. And of course, it's just a dumb animal. It's different than us. It doesn't have feelings. It's not that different from that to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Identify a difference, remove empathy, and see other sentient things as utilities for your advantage. and then a whole kind of cultural system that sees everybody else as a utility rather than a subject to various degrees. So interesting as you can see that the introduction of the plow actually ended animism, changed value systems to a more utilitarian relationship to other sentient things. The plow couldn't be run by women because it required a more upper body strength, and women would miscarry when they were doing that. And so men were now hunting and doing the plow. The gods changed from male and female god distributions to largely all just male god distributions. This was covered in Ken Wilber's Sex Ecology and Spirit. It has a lot of footnotes in there. And then it gave a huge amount of surplus, more surplus than there had ever been, which started to lead to more capacity for wealth inequality and needing to formalize ownership rather than the tribes. So the larger populations plus the ability to store huge amounts of surplus started to mean wealth inequality and all the things that came with that, which started to mean hierarchical organization. Like, wow, everything from the commodification of nature to changing whole ecosystems to turn them from forests to row crops. So the beginning of the Anthropocene, to patriarchy, to extreme wealth inequality, to hierarchical governance systems were the side effects of a technology that met some seemingly good purpose of feed the people. And so then you're like, wow, okay, how do we really think through if it does a thing and then for the people to do that, it has to code patterns of belief that go along with those patterns of behavior. And then it's not just one technology, because then you have to have the baskets to store the grain and you have to have the threshers. So it's also part of an entire ecosystem of technologies. You get a laptop, but then you also need the external camera and the modem and the satellites and the whatever, right? All those things. So technologies emerge in ecosystems. The whole ecosystem of technologies ends up predisposing a whole world. So this is the topic of a psychosocial externality, that the technology is affecting our psyches inexorably, all the way from what we pay attention to what we value, to what we believe is as real. And this is where what I want people who are technologists to think about is the physical externalities, i.e., how much energy does it take to run the Ethereum world computer and how does that affect climate change and all that stuff, physical externalities, but also the psychosocial externalities, and internalize those externalities into the design process, which means if we build a tool that provides some advantage where people using that advantage are behaving differently, how is that coding minds? And then how does that code cultures? And where does it do that in ways that might be destructive? And how do we think through that better and then design better?
Right. One of the things I think is most interesting about this is that I kind of grew up, or maybe wanted to think, that our values are what's designing the technology. But the way you frame it is, it almost feels like we're rationalizing our values to fit the technology that has the evolutionary advantage or the economic advantage in the Web3 space.
So this is half true, and now we'll move. So if people haven't read Marvin Harris' Cultural Materialism, it's really important and great work that basically says what you just said. Like the thing that really obviously changes as new technological capacities. Those technological capacities require, and they both enable and require, changes in social systems and ideologies and cultures. But the other ones are always playing catch up to the tech. I don't think that's true. That's what he's arguing there. I think it's a part of the truth. I think it's true that we can use culture to shape the way we do tech. It's also true that tech in turn shapes culture. So it's a recursive process. And you can have kind of virtuous or vicious cycles. But one way of, like, this is a real politic kind of assessment, but the dominant ideology or the dominant narrative of a culture is the apologism for the power structure of that culture. Right? It kind of has to be. And so, of course, if you have a crusades that are spreading Christianity around the world, including with violence and destruction to other cultures, that also happens to be making certain kings and emperors very, very profitable and have a Holy Roman Empire that covers lots of territory or whatever. But everybody feels good about it because the belief system of we need to spread Christendom because this is what God wants is good apologism. Today, it's like techno-capital optimism. In the, Pinker, Rosling, Gates, etc. sense that tech makes things better and capitalism makes things better, so keep doing more of it. Obviously, that's the winners of the current system making a value system where the thing they're doing is the right thing to do and everybody should want to do more of it.
Yeah.
So I would say critical theorists are kind of very attuned to, is the dominant narrative just a bullshit trope for the power structure? And if so, who isn't well tended to by that power structure? Which is why typically, this is why the
Yeah.
social justice movement is actually an epistemic and a design movement too. It's those who got most marginalized and fucked by the system who are the most capable of seeing where its narrative is lying. Or if not lying, at least missing something, not true. So then they can be like, oh, this looks more like apologism for power dynamics than it does like a clear assessment of how a civilization should ideally work. And so then that has the ability to either just try to tear that system down or hopefully offer a critical perspective for how to improve it. And so what I hope happens here is as people are looking at how do we design fundamentally new political economies, it would be, how do we make sure that every stakeholder, human and non-human life, that's going to be affected by the second and third order externalities, the physical and the psychosocial ones, how do we make sure that we're in conversation with them where their perspectives are being factored, and we don't get that it's an ideology of winners in something that is also creating losers and externalizing harm? And so, yes, it is true that generally the values we have are justifying the use of the tech. But it can also be true that we can have a value system where we're like, no, there's something we really value. We want to codify law to actually bind tech and not use it in a particular way, right? We actually don't want to let the chainsaws and whatever logging technology cut down the national parks. So the values of the people are going to instantiate law that then binds the technology and the private incentive from not doing a particular thing. That would be an example of the causation going the other direction. And or like weapons ban. Even though the tech can do this thing, we actually have a value system where we just don't want to let that thing happen. So now this comes to the framework that Marvin Harris put forward that I would like to just make a little modification of. He, following kind of Marx's analysis, even though I wouldn't call him Marxist, he said you can think about a civilization in terms of three major ways of kind of dividing it that all necessarily interact. What he called the infrastructure, the social structure, and the superstructure. And the infrastructure was the whole tech stack by which the people did the things they needed to do and all the needs were mediated. So the modes of production, transportation, waste management, energy, all that stuff. And obviously, if we're talking about a hunter-gatherer tribe, they have a tech stack. They have spears and they have tools that are used to be able to make spears, and they have storage vessels and they have shoes and they have clothes to be able to be adapted to environments that they weren't biologically adapted. And they couldn't operate without that tech stack, right? And as soon as you move to a agrarian culture, you have a plow and you have yoking devices and you have fencing technologies and you have storage vessels and you have whatever, all these types of things. So that's infrastructure. The social structure is the collective agreement field. So governance, law, economics, primarily, and the institutions that mediate it. And the superstructure is basically the values of the people, the religion, the ideology, the how do we do meaning making of what the good life is that we want to orient towards. And what Marvin Harris was kind of structuring is that the changes in infrastructure drive changes in social structure and superstructure. That without a printing press, you couldn't have had democracy because you had to have everybody be able to have access to a newspaper and everyone have access to textbooks and be educated. And that not only was that capacitating for democracy, but it was also destructive for feudalism, where the concentration of power in that way also required the concentration of knowledge, where that new tool changed it. And it's interesting to see that where the printing press uh, was a democratizing force. It gave everybody access to something that only a few had. After a while, it also became an even more powerful centralizing force, right? Where you have these few major broadcast stations that could now broadcast information at a much wider distance than anybody had ever been able to for larger populations. You see that with the internet. It was like everybody's ability to upload their own video is going to be this massive democratizing force and get over broadcast consolidation, except when there's a billion videos on anything, the video player that can put them all in one place and determine which ones I see ends up becoming tech that is what sorts it. So YouTube and Google and Facebook become the new centralizing force that are even more powerful than the biggest broadcast media station was before. In general, all major changes in tech tend to be decentralizing at first because they break the existing power structure, and then they tend to become centralizing over time because some people are better at it than other people, and they get these recursive loops of the better that they get. And so to say any tech is inherently decentralizing, you just got to think through that really well. So what I would say is that infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure, all three interaffect each other. If you changed the economics fundamentally, where certain costs had to be internalized into the cost equation, certain technologies would not be profitable to create and they wouldn't proliferate, and other technologies would be profitable and they would proliferate. If you make law that bound certain things, again, certain types of tech wouldn't proliferate and other ones would. If you change the superstructure of what people actually want and what they're willing to engage with, it would. And so we're not saying that the value systems and the social structures can't guide the tech. We're saying that the tech also in turn changes them. So what we want is people who have a more inclusive value system that's starting at the level of superstructure to start to design and build technologies where the other people's use of those technologies will also support the growth of those same values. And where the social structures that get created, how does the law work? How does the economics work in turn are also aligned with the proliferation of those more inclusive values.
Beautiful. You mind if I recap for a minute?
Please.
Cool. So, been taking some notes here. From the top, tech increases our ability to actuate and also to sense. So, we're all in these kind of like OODA loops: observe, orient, decide, and act. And tech increases our ability to observe and to act. But tech doesn't just enhance our ability to do those things, it also kind of slants by embedding our values into things. It affects psychologies and cultures. So there's physical externalities. So if I look at my phone, I'm going to hurt my neck. Psychosocial externalities. Tech is an incentive to tech has an incentive to use it, which confers an advantage, and then it becomes compulsory. And the other psychosocial externality that I wrote down is body dysmorphia. So like outrage, the Facebook example that it's designed to keep me on site longer, and so that creates an algorithm that, as a side effect, creates more outrage that polarizes the population. So for myself and the Web3 ecosystem as systems designers, we want to think about externalities, both physical and psychosocial, and think about how to confer an advantage to systems that solve the meta crisis in order to make that kind of tech advantaged, especially in a networked age, in a high-tech age where the question is existential. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but they're not going to blow up the world in a nuclear catastrophe. So the how big the problem is has gotten bigger with bigger and bigger tech. So to me, this leads to this question of like, what does the internet do? And what does Ethereum do? How does it code minds? And how does it code cultures? And how can we be in conversation with everyone in the system, both humans and nature, as we're designing a system that can build and solve the meta crisis? And then of course infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure are all intertwined. If we have values of building and funding digital public goods, solving coordination failures, those are the people who should be building this infrastructure. Those are all the notes I wrote down. I don't know if there's anything I missed, or is that directionally accurate?
It was a good recap.
Okay. Cool. So, where should we go next? I think next on my notes, I have conflict theory and mistake theory to get into next, but I'm curious if there's another place you want to go.
Yeah, let's come back to that. I want to do one more piece regarding this unique category of tech that
Mm,
is the tech that the aspect of the infrastructure that mediates the social structure. So notice if we say what is the technology that enables Facebook? And obviously whether we're talking Facebook or TikTok or YouTube or whatever, there are certain things that are in common across all of those, but it's not
yeah.
it's not video player tech. It's the ability to take my online behavior when I'm particularly when I'm on platform and record my mouse usage and click patterns and stuff like that, and then be able to have AI do pattern analysis for pattern prediction,
Hmm.
and then have it be able to give me split tested stuff to be able to upregulate its pattern prediction, to be able to develop a predictive model of behavior that is fully personalized, and then be able to put specific pieces of content in front of people to affect their behavior in specific ways, all driven by a profit motive in which the user is
Mm,
not the customer. The user is, ad sales. And so the customer being engaged to spend more time on site, engage with the content more so that more ads come across them and that the right type of ads come across them is what that data is being used for. And so we can see that, like, of course, at the superstructure level, human belief and values and emotions and identity are going to be conditioned by what we're paying attention to.
mm,
You can't pay attention to stuff and have it have no effect on the nature of your mind and inner experience. And this is why, you know, every culture has some version of a statement like you become the average of the five people you spend the most time around, and the mimesis of learning. We learn language simply by watching. We also learn belief systems and all those things by watching what we're surrounded by. So if I can't observe the world because there's too much of the world, so now I'm observing a subset of the world that is customized for me, that
hmm
I can't not take as the world, right? Because it's what I'm actually taking in. And it happens to be being customized for me,
Yeah.
based on things that will commodify me.
Yeah.
And it happens to be that my emotions commodify me better than my rationality. So it will appeal on
Hmm.
those things. And my identity being part of an in group will commodify me better. That the design of that tech, meaning the incentive economic system plus the way that suite of technologies are used, is changing culture.
Yeah.
It can't not
And,
change culture.
and the one thing I'll add here is that we're talking about a supercomputer that is trained on hundreds of millions of data sets, and it's pointed at our brains when we're using these systems. So we're way outgunned. It's like a hot knife through butter in changing our attention.
Yeah, we already were saying as far as the kind of like voluntarism idea, it's the market, so you don't have to buy the thing. It's just
Yeah.
a gibberish argument. One, it's like saying, do you have to use dollars? Well, no, I could try to just barter, right? Like, but I'm going to be so radically disadvantaged that and since there's a monopoly on the creation of currency, I pretty much have to fucking participate with that monopoly if I want to be effective at all. When do I have to use the telephone lines when there was AT&T ran all the telephones? It's like pretty much I do. If I could, so to say that I am voluntarily engaging if I don't have an authentic choice to still be viable in society. If a small business doesn't advertise on any of the major platforms, it's pretty fucking hard to be a viable small business, right?
Yeah.
And then, as we were mentioning with the plow case, if any if any other country starts making AI weapons, do we really have a choice not to? Not really, right? We're probably going to do that thing because otherwise we kind of obligately lose. So
Mm,
it's important to understand that the voluntarism argument is there's a lot of places where we would pretend it's more true than it is. So if tech confers a bunch of advantage, some people will start using it, and then that will be used for conflict theory. And then it does require the other people to either use that or some comparable thing, or they stop
mm,
mattering. And And so we come back to the Facebook thing. You were saying, this is this huge uh,
Supercomputer.
AI supercomputer directed at our brains. Um, Now we also have a situation that, one, we don't really have the capacity to choose to not engage with the whole suite of those technologies and still be effective at certain domains of society. And then the other thing is that it's like saying, well, it's voluntary whether or not we engage with ads and whether we purchase a thing. I don't actually get a choice in those environments of whether or not I'm exposed to them, nor do I get a choice of if my personal data is harvested and used with AI type dynamics to compel me to do that thing. And the
Yeah.
asymmetry of it is so fucking much that it's like, okay, this is why we wrote in that paper about the topic of undue influence. No, that was actually a different paper on the Consilience Project where we talk about that undue influence of like someone is choosing something but they're under some type of cult mind control, or like why it's not okay for a professor or a therapist or a priest to be in
Mm.
an intimate relationship with someone, is the other person really, there's so much power asymmetry they can't consent adequately, that even if they're consenting, the asymmetry of power messes up the integrity of their consent.
Nice.
That's the
We'll link that article in the show notes. I just found it. Put it in there.
right. So we would propose that if information about you that enables from your behavior that enables a platform to predict your behavior better than your wife or therapist or lawyer could, that is privileged information, that does enable undue influence, that needs to be in a fiduciary contract, a principal agent binding contract, where whoever is using that is using it for you, not in any way against you. And so that would mean that those tech platforms had to actually have a fiduciary relationship with you, the user, to only use that information aligned with your interests, where you had full visibility in the
Mm.
settings and could change all of it. That would, of course, require a change of business model, probably where you are the customer or the state that is representing you or the commons that is representing
Mm.
you is. Um, so as we get into tech that is more powerful, the asymmetry of those who are using it relative to everyone else also becomes a bigger deal. And that affects the
Mm.
nature of social systems radically, is when there's such radical asymmetry of information processing. Can you really still just say buyer beware when the buyer can't begin to deal with
Mm.
weighing all of the things that the other side that's using an AI and we're not can factor?
Right. Does this get into to sort of like the political theory in such a way, at least with the Facebook example, where Facebook's management is optimizing for the shareholders instead of the customers, and so
No, it's
you
optimizing for the customers as well. It's just the customers are the advertisers, not the users.
right?
That's actually
Okay.
the point, is that the users should be the customers.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is like there's this idea in political theory that the consent of the governed is the only legitimate basis for governance, as opposed
Right.
to like the divine right of kings. And what if the Facebook users were owners of the platform and had, like management had to sort of like optimize for them in a little bit more of like you said, a fiduciary obligation kind of way.
Yes,
Like,
that's
does
what
it?
it should be. Otherwise, the people are actually the thing being extracted from. Like we used to extract
Mhm.
from nature, now we're extracting from human minds the particular kinds of behavioral predispositions we want for the extension of power. Um, but should Facebook have the user be a customer? Yes, but should it go further? Should it actually be a public good? And that if it has that capacity to affect human behavior at scale, what the fuck should drive that, right? And this,
Yeah.
well, and should the consent of the governed have some say in the governance of a thing that is going to have AIs pointed at their mind? And so then you're like, oh, well, it should be a DAO of some kind. And then you're like, well, fuck, isn't that what the government should be? And now that it's not 1776 technology with a town hall, but can we actually similarly have a process? Because when you say the consent of the governed, what you're saying is that superstructure needs to be the basis of social structure, right? That social structure, law specifically, if it is not an instantiation of the will of the people, it will be tyrannical. For it to be an instantiation of the will of the people, then the thing that really matters is not only how do we actually listen to what the values of the people are, but how do we make sure we're developing people that have better sense making and deeper and richer meaning making. So that because the will of a very uneducated xenophobic audience is not a great thing, which is actually why kings made sense in low development environments. So how do we develop superstructure to have an increasingly considerate population? And then how do we have that creating the laws that both utilize and also bind, guide, and direct the technology? And I would say what's happened is we've got exponential curves in infrastructure during the digital age, but we have not got exponentially faster governance or exponentially faster growth of morals, virtues, and epistemology and culture. And as a result, the effects of infrastructure influencing the other ones have radically increased, and the effects of the integrity of the social structure influencing, or of the superstructure, the culture influencing the social structures to bind the tech has radically decreased and got hollowed out. And yet I would say it's that direction from the values of the people, from the superstructure to a healthy social structure that has the OODA loops, that has the capacity itself to bind, guide, direct the technology to be in service of what the superstructure wants it in service to, what the collective will of the people does. That is the critical direction that we must increase to make it through Metacrisis. So that means we have to be both thinking about human values and how we support the proliferation and the development of human values, how we encode those in our decision-making systems, and how we make sure that our tech is not only bound by those decision-making systems, but that the use of the tech, that the psychosocial effects of it are in turn in service of a enrichment of the structure.
Immutable X is the layer 2 platform for crypto gaming. Immutable offers massive scalability with up to 9,000 transactions per second and instant transaction confirmation. No more gas fees, no more waiting around for your transaction to clear. Immutable's zero knowledge rollup finally unlocks the world of crypto gaming. Immutable X is the only gas-free NFT minting platform with over 26 million NFTs minted, all with zero gas fees. With the power of Immutable, gaming developers don't also need to become smart contract developers, they just need to plug in to Immutable's API and instantly start unlocking the full potential of crypto assets inside of games. This is why world-class companies and projects have decided to deploy on Immutable X, like GameStop, Ember Sword, Planet Quest, Illuvium, TikTok, and many more behind the scenes. So start building your game on Immutable X today at immutable.com. CoinShift is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses who need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage their treasury, and CoinShift offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the extremely secure Gnosis Safe. With CoinShift, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasuries to expressive, flexible, multi-chain features such as global user management, global contracts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization. CoinShift layers on powerful treasury management tools on top of the proven security of Gnosis Safe, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. CoinShift even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Messari, CoinShift is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. In DeFi, you have to keep up with the frontier, and CoinShift makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/Bankless.
So let's go into conflict theory and mistake theory next. Curious to pull that thread.
Yeah. So we're talking about externalities, and typically we think of an externality as a mistake. We didn't intend the laptop to hurt people's necks. Like that wasn't a built-in thing. It was just an unforeseen consequence or something that we, yeah. And similarly, nobody intended climate change. They intended to build their businesses, and their businesses required energy, and the cumulative effect of everybody doing that caused climate change. So we think this is not like an intentionally created problem. It's a problem that is a byproduct of solving some other problem. And but obviously, there are places where somebody causes harm because they want to invade that area and get access to those materials or that port or that whatever it is, or so whether they are initiating conflict on purpose or at least they know that it'll cause harm and they don't care, right? Maybe it's the intent or they don't care. So there is a blog post on the Less Wrong blog, I think, with this title, Conflict versus Mistake Theory, and it's subset of a very large conversation in kind of social theory about what percentage of the problems in the world are the result of simply not being able to factor all of the second and third order consequences, and what percentage of it are the result of uh, things that are being initiated knowingly. I think the article does a good job of discussing considerations on both sides, but the thread is particularly interesting of comments afterwards. Michael
Right.
Vassar is a very interesting thinker in there, specifically goes into that the existence of mistake theory ends up being used as a cover for a lot of things that are actually conflict theory.
Mm.
Meaning that we can, knowing that I can say later, oh, that was an unintended consequence, we could have never predicted it, I can hide
Right.
the fact that I actually knew that thing was going to happen,
Cr-
or at minimum, not try really hard to figure it out because it's
Yeah.
against my incentive to try to figure it out. So then
Mhm.
I have mistake theory as plausible deniability that I didn't intentionally do the fucked up thing.
Yeah.
And so I think when we're thinking about tech design and social systems, we want to think about conflict theory. What is the underlying basis of what gets humans into conflict with each other, individual humans, groups of humans, and humans as a whole with the environment? And how do we resolve the underlying bases of conflict? And obviously, economics is very core to that. It's not the whole of it. Um, Marx has his analysis of conflict theory. Girard has his analysis. If anyone wants to solve any of the problems of the world, this is one of the things to go deep on is what are the various things that initiate human conflict, and what would it take to create a system that addressed those more fundamentally?
Mm.
Not just conflict mediation, but uh, conflict generation, mitigation, how to mitigate that. Um, and because the mistake theory part, we can do a much better job procedurally of that if we had the incentives. Meaning, if we had the motivation, incentives, and deterrence, and intrinsic values.
Mm.
So, uh, can we predict all of the effects of a new tech? No, of course not. Can can we do a much better job than we've ever done? Easily.
Mm.
And so, can we predict all the effects is the same as predicting weather a ways out. In complex systems, you end up not being able to predict beyond a certain point. But uh, for instance, just even thinking through with a framework like physical externalities and psychosocial externalities, and getting a group of people that represent different stakeholders that would be touched by the system and that represent different expertise, and just say, let's think through all the possible externalities based on patterns of human use using this, and based on the supply chains that it'll take to make this thing happen. All of a sudden, we anticipate a lot of stuff we wouldn't have anticipated. And then we say, well, if those things happen, what are the externalities those produce to get a third order event,
Mhm.
right? And so then we start thinking about that and saying, how could we design it differently that internalize that? And similarly,
Mm.
thinking about something like the relationship of infrastructure to social structure and superstructure, you get to start to think, well, what are the effects of this on the systems of human governance and social structures? What are the
Mm.
effects on the superstructures? And obviously, all of that is embedded within the biosphere. What are the effects on the biosphere? So these are frameworks for being able to consider externalities better. Then, of course, there will be some things that you didn't predict. So you want to create monitoring systems. And you also want
Mm.
to create tests, right? How do we test this at a small scale, what we call a safe to fail probe? Uh, and Dave Snowden's terms. And um, then be able to observe what are the things that happen, including stuff. Since we don't even know what to predict, how do we make just very kind of wide observations and notice new stuff that starts to emerge, and then be able to factor that? But then, of
Mhm.
course, what we need is that, let's say we make a technology and it's off and running, and we did all of our good upfront assessment. We still need to be watching what are the other things that it does. And we also even want to be incentivizing a decentralized intelligence to show us unintended consequence, right? And then we'll need to figure out how to solve that in terms of a recursive design of the technology, or a design of the social system, i.e., a law or something that will affect the utilization of the technology. And then we have to actually be able to enact that. So you can't move from the tech designers to now the CEO and board of directors have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize return on shareholders, and it doesn't matter if you create an externality, you don't ever get to change it. So you actually have to build into the governance protocol of the thing the ability for ongoing recursion that internalizes externalities when they're found. But the underlying reason not to do that, because procedurally what I just said is not that hard. It's not obvious, but once you hear it, it's kind of obvious. And it's not perfect, but it's like so many orders of magnitude better than what we do. But then you're like, okay, well, the other issue is the conflict theory, the perverse incentive. So let me explain the perverse incentive that is underneath much of the problem here. Is that I'll specifically talk about market applications. There is much more incentive to focus on the upsides of a technology than the risks. There's much more of an incentive for a technologist and a funder and a lawmaker and a politician and a whatever who can bind themselves to those upsides, right? So let's just say for the technologist, if I say, oh, we're going to make this AI thing and it's going to like do protein folding and solve all these diseases and do all this amazing stuff, and everybody wants it for those reasons. Yeah, well, but what about all the rest of the really terrible things? It'll do, oh, no, it's not going to do those terrible things. Of course, whoever focuses on that moves faster, gets first mover advantage in the market, gets the race to network dynamics, massive adoption of their thing. Whoever goes slower to say, hey, wait, we're not sure. We're doing this protracted process of anticipating second and third order negative effects, and we found a bunch, and we're internalizing those into the design. So we're iterating the design a lot. Those people just get out competed by the other people who just rush to market. So the incentive is to not look for where it's going to harm things, or to do a bullshit job where you do some box ticking thing that says, oh, we did due diligence, but you really don't want to know anything that's going to mess up the speed to market. And so this is where things that are actually conflict theory get to hide as if they're mistake theory. And this is where you have to factor the relationship between those topics well. But when you're thinking about new technologies in, say, the Web3 space, you want to be able to think about what new types of conflict theory dynamics does this actually enable? Like, where does it enable the people who are better at this technology to have more game theoretic ability over the people who are less good at it? Where does having this type of spear or chainsaw incentivize thinking in certain ways? What are the effects of those things? How can this increase or decrease the underlying basis of conflict in the space? And of course, when we're trying to think of governance tech, how do we make it to where there isn't this perverse incentive to not focus on externalities? Well, you could do things like really tight attribution, where everything in your ecosystem actually does have to pay for the externalities that are found later. And so it becomes catastrophically unprofitable. Whereas right now, the company gets to privatize its gains and socialize almost all the losses.
Yeah. Could
we make a system where the externalities have tighter attribution or internalized, and so it actually affects the cost equation and the incentive? We have a situation where you actually do regulation from something like a DAO first, right? You create some new governance protocol, and before a new technology is rolled out, the people actually have to see that its risk analysis was good enough. So it's not the technology rolls out, and after we see that it ruined everything, like DDT or cigarettes or whatever, then we try to regulate after the fact, which once you're an exponential tech, it's too late to do that shit. You can't let out self-replicating biotech and then after it's ruined everything, say, oh, we should regulate that. It's too late. Or AI. So we actually have to say before tech gets released into the market, is this safe? Did it actually pass enough, appropriate process? Which of course happens in some areas. The FDA is supposed to, before getting authorization, to, ensure oversight of drug safety. But that's not the case in almost anything in software for these purposes. But as we're showing, have even bigger effects on culture than any particular drug would.
Yeah. And we've got the saying coming out of the Valley, move fast and break things. It's almost the exact opposite culture of what you're talking about.
Remember how we said that the dominant narrative is apologism for the power system?
Yeah.
move fast and break things. Oh, we're all about disruption and coming up with innovative new stuff, and we're
Yeah.
willing to like fail and be these great innovators. It's just like
Yeah.
what you're talking about is having privatized a fuck ton of gains and socialized the losses, because what you broke was the social contract of the entire fucking country and the epistemic commons and the ability for anybody to believe
Yeah.
anything to solve climate change. Like, if what you broke is the biosphere in the country, no, that was not a good thing to do. That was really fucking stupid.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to hear about the conflict theory, which is kind of like initiating harm via conflict on purpose. Maybe there's a scarcity of resources, and then mistake theory, creating harm via an externality of not knowing, and then the plausible deniability of really being in conflict theory, and but treating it as mistake theory in order to get away with it. Is there anything more to say about that in the intersection of what we've talked about?
Yeah, I would really love to see Web3 developers taking mistake theory super seriously and saying, what are the
Yeah.
possible negative effects, psychosocial, particularly effects of this technology proliferating? How do we incorporate it into the design? And then
Yeah.
where are the incentives of people to overemphasize the positives and move fast and they might break things? Because
Yeah.
where they have an incentive to be focused on the upside, they are probably in conflict theory. They're going to blow past preventing mistake theory they could have. And so you really want to look at, where do the incentives give people less orientation to pay attention to real risks, second and third order consequences and risks?
Hmm.
Where does the incentive landscape and deterrent landscape, where they'll be able to socialize the harms later or have plausible deniability they didn't really cause it, or attribution issues? And so for the Web3 world to say, let's really look at the incentives well
Hmm.
and make sure that there aren't ones that are fucking up our ability to think through the effects. And then let's look at, what are we really trying to serve? Are we trying to serve a thriving biosphere and a thriving human society? If so, we don't want to externalize harm anywhere. We know these technologies are going to be powerful. How do we really think through what that power is doing and where
Hmm.
the trade-offs are and whatever's being benefited, what's being harmed? So how do we hold more procedural rigor in doing that? And how do we identify where there's incentives not to do it, to both try to change those incentives and to know where to be dubious of certain
Hmm.
claims?
Right. So, I mean, I guess, you and I are going to wrap this episode soon, but for episode 3 and episode 4, we're talking about how Web3 can help address the meta crisis. I'm almost imagining a scorecard here in which we can take a couple of projects, hold them up to the prism of ways of what we've developed here, looking at each project within the lens of conflict theory and mistake theory, recognizing that tech is not values neutral, looking at the narratives that have been manufactured by each project, looking at how they intersect with the infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure, and then also looking at whether or not these projects confer an adapted advantage to their participants, or at least not a disadvantage. Or is kind of like my scorecard for something that's going to work and is something that is going to help address the meta crisis. But I don't know if there's anything to add to that list.
Um, the scorecard involves things that are qualitative, right? Not just
Yeah.
quantitative. So you can't make the decision based on just expected value calculus where you've converted everything to quantitative and then the same metrics.
Darn.
So that means actually something like human wisdom is still at the center of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Earnestness and honesty and wisdom to be able to factor, because as soon as you get into the, okay, well, here's the trade off. And if we do this thing, we can solve this problem, but it'll cause this other problem. Then I have to say,
Yeah.
how many dead whales are worth how many tons of CO2 are worth how many abused children.
Yeah.
And you just, any version of doing that ends up turning into somewhere between nonsense and evil.
Mhm.
And this is one of the things I really want the Web3 community to get, is that you cannot convert the world into quantification. There's a lot of qualified stuff that cannot be quantified, and there's a lot of quantified metrics that are uncommensurable. And that if you make them commensurable, you do it at a disadvantage to reality.
Mhm.
And so what that means is there's a lot of decisions that cannot be made in a metrified way, which means they cannot just be automated and computed. They actually do require adjudication and discernment. And so how we actually grow populations capable of holding that complexity and the qualified things and the uncomparable things and making wise choices has to stay at the center of our focus.
Mm-hmm.
And so that scorecard is not a metrified one. Like there are some metrics, but it's
Yeah.
asking like, are they, where are the incentives? A lot of those will be squishy because some of the incentives will
Yeah.
just be like status or whatever. And like, did they do the risk analysis well?
Yeah.
It's going to be, you'll get an index maybe, but you're not going to be able
Mm.
to do a perfect quantification because how do you know what was not included that maybe should have been included?
Yeah.
And so a scorecard on process, was there earnest and deep and rigorous process?
Mm.
Yes. And it won't be perfect, but it's directionally right. A, a pre-computable thing. Mm-mm.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
considerations that we would like the Web3 superstructure, the Web3 culture to hold very deeply, where
Mm-hmm.
people like one thing I'll say about the future is that if we are to have a future where we make it through the Metacrisis, we will be less focused on design systems of extrinsic incentive and more motivated around intrinsic incentive associated with a deeper connection to life.
Mm-hmm.
And if I am deeply connected to nature and to people, that connection informs an embodied ethics. That
Mm-hmm.
intimacy informs an embodied ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And the systems of extrinsic incentive are basically how do you control people based on their selfishness
Mm.
because they don't have ethics or to even override them. And so I actually
Yeah.
want people to do shit based on incentive and reward much less. And I would like to
Mm.
be able to enable people to have needs met and have then a deeper existential development is what is
Yeah.
actually meaningful and worth doing with our short lives
Yeah.
here.
It's interesting. The ETH Barcelona conference just happened, and they had every speaker come on stage and touch grass. They literally had grass up on stage, which I guess grounded them a little bit of nature in the heart of the city.
Something.
Yeah, it's a start. Um, I'm also imagining this like I'm in an imperfect vessel for this conversation because I only have a certain vantage point on even Gitcoin. Like it's gotten so big that I don't even know everything that's happening, and it almost feels like a distributed intelligence question of in mapping all of the externalities. You almost have to look at it from the hyperstructure from all of the different vantage points of it happening. I mean, I think we can take a stab at it in episodes 3 and 4, but the real thing is empowering the everyday citizens of the Web3 space to have these conversations and almost to create a hyperstructure that can like rate projects on their ability to solve the meta crisis and help them find the externalities and like
This is why the diversity perspective is important,
yeah.
is because if nobody in there actually lives in an industrial zone,
Mm,
like physically and knows what it's like to live in an industrial zone, or if nobody actually lives in poverty or any of those things, and there's just types of experience they are completely unclued to, and they just can't academically clue into the reality of it in a way that anyone who lives there can. And so, the question of like, hey, do you have people from other classes? Do you have people from other races? Do you have people from all the genders? Do you have them there as
yeah.
because they have different experiences? And their
Yeah.
experiences are like, hey, you're fucking designing civilization for who? You're designing a thing that's going to affect a lot of things through all the second and third order effects. Do you have everybody who's affected by it weighing in on it? And it's specifically what you just said is that they can anticipate some of the externalities differently
Mm,
because they experience it differently because they're in a different part of the system. So if you
yeah.
think of them as sensors, if you think of this as like a human Internet of Things sensor system, then of course I want a wide distribution of human sensors all giving the feedback of what they're sensing in the various aspects of the system to design a better system.
Yeah.
And so then rather than so often we design a thing, we take it as very precious, we don't want to criticize, we fight for it. No, fuck that. Like design a thing and then ask everybody for what's wrong with it,
Yeah.
knowing that what they're offering you is the gift of how to make it better that you couldn't have seen. And then ask
Yeah.
them, how do I make it better? How do I factor these things? So
Mm,
let's say you start having red teaming the design, not just the security, but the design from an externality point of view. Identify all the externalities here.
mhm.
And then that be something that is proceduralized and even incentivized in a
Mm,
distributed way. And then, okay, well, we got all these things. Now we're going to incentivize anyone that can come up with solutions for them that don't cause other externalities in the process.
mhm,
That's how you get a decentralized collective intelligence thinking about the right things and actually synthesizing its intelligence.
mhm. I think that's a great place to end for this episode. We've got
Great.
some great conversations set up for episode 3. Maybe one last question I'll ask you before we break is, how should we select what projects we discuss for episode 3? I mean, obviously, I have a lot of knowledge of and experience with Web3 on Ethereum, and Gitcoin is a project I founded, but it's now a big DAO. What kind of projects do you think we should hold up to the lens in the next episode that we do?
We can certainly pick ones that either are some of the um, most prominent or possibly most promising ones, or talking about some design aspects that are pretty fundamental, which we can
Mm,
do. And if you want to open this up as you put it out there for people to say, hey, what about this? And
yeah.
propose projects or specific technologies or ideas,
Yeah,
anything that people are particularly interested in would be fun for us to have a look at.
great. Yeah, I think accepting submissions from the crowd would be great. Is there anything I didn't ask you, Daniel, that you want to say?
Not in this time. I'm looking forward to next
Okay.
times. And this was a fun round two.
Yeah. So enjoying the series that we're doing together. You're so lucid. You're so articulate. You're many steps ahead, thinking in so many different things, and I'm thankful for this collaboration with you. So thanks again,
I,
Daniel.
I'm excited about thinking about you having a whole community of people that can actually build stuff, that are incentivized to build stuff and actually care about things like public commons, taking these types of considerations seriously and starting to have conversations like, okay, well, let's take this podcast as like a book club and then let's talk about it, dialogue, set up
Yeah.
processes, and actually make a collective intelligence that has some of the deeper theoretical framing to inform the building. That's actually really exciting to me. That's why I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. It's the synthesis of theory and action, I
Yep.
think, and if we can bring those people together, that'd be really great.
Thanks, man.
Thank you so much.